Hello everybody, good afternoon. Thank you for coming out. Especially thank you to Dr. Morris and members of the Night ADRC that I was able to meet and get to know a little bit better today, but also for the great opportunity to be here today, especially in light of Mr. Seay's legacy, in which I would like to take just a moment to recognize all of the work, his peaceful but very purposeful and impactful civil rights activism that has inspired myself and scores of others, but also his advocacy, his ardent advocacy for Alzheimer's research, especially among African Americans. Okay, so take a minute for that. As you may notice, there's a small title change here. I kind of changed some things around as I was reflecting on three pieces before today. One was just simply my own program of research, and which largely includes, of course, mixed methodologies, meaning not just surveys or questionnaires, but also getting to know the participant perspective there, and thinking about all that I've seen during that time, both scientifically, professionally, and personally, but also those observations, working with many in this room, working while in psychiatry, and also my observations while being a Black woman in this country. But I also thought critically about Mr. Seay's legacy, and that was one of activism. So as I was thinking about African American participation in Alzheimer's research, three words kept coming to mind. That was alignment, agency, and activism. So before we get fully started, a word on activism for me. I don't fancy myself an activist in no way or shape or form, but in reflecting on Mr. Seay, getting to know other activists in Chicago, I noticed they had a knack for something that I think we're doing in this room now, and that's the recognition of a window of time. Meaning, you see an issue, so say Alzheimer's and the impact it has on African American communities, and you say, if we don't do something about this fully, critically, as a whole, we're in for a world of hurt later on. So that is an opportunity. But I was feeling ever since last year when I attended the African American Recruitment and Retention Workshop that the time is now to do so. And the four elements that I see in activism is that the recognition of the issue, not only the recognition, but having a critical mass of people with generations worth of information, also new faces, and even more up and coming folks behind me that are willing to address these issues, and not only address but change, and also the openness of colleagues who are able to say, you know what, maybe I could reconsider that, or maybe I will think about this as well in my own work. But then seizing that opportunity. What are the best practices? What are the strategies that we use, say, here at the Night ADRC, at the Rush ADC, but also abroad? How can we do that to leverage now and to ultimately implement those, not just in our ADCs, but across the country and hopefully across the world? Okay. So today I have it kind of broken down into three pieces. The first two issues I hope to see as the past, so it's really past, present, and what I see as the future. And the past being that the issues that we're facing now in terms of Alzheimer's disease, especially in light of African Americans, but then also where are we? What are some things that we're doing, say in my own program of research, to help remedy this? So not necessarily just disparity and documentation, but action. And then also where I would like to see the field, as well as outreach, recruitment, and engagement, in my opinion, going forward. So the first issue that I don't particularly want to belabor, but that we know that African Americans are twice as likely to be at risk for Alzheimer's compared to whites. When I see this, I think of what's to the right here, meaning wellness. And when I see decreased wellness biologically, psychologically, socially, and I would even argue spiritually, not simply for the person who is afflicted with the disease, but for their caregivers, their family members, their community, and largely people in this room, folks that interact with us on an everyday basis, are operating with diminished quality of life and lacking in being stripped of the ability to have healthy aging. Coupled with that issue would be the severe underrepresentation of African Americans in Alzheimer's research. Now, this is not accidental. It didn't happen yesterday or last year, nor in the lifetime of anyone in this room. As I noted last year, we could see the rumblings of this in the seeds sowed in 1619 when we had the first Africans arrive on our shores and enslaved. These things are systematic here. However, they present real problems that we have to confront now and work together in order to alleviate. Now, this is a larger systems issue, and I don't expect, say, anyone to take responsibility for that, including myself, but what I'm really thinking about is community, institution, interpersonal, and intrapersonal. Meaning, how are we thinking about this how are racial disparities talking to us through our work, the techniques we use, the way that we engage with many groups of people, the institutions that we are at? What does that look like? How are we meaningfully engaging with folks to really address not only imbalance, which is what disparity is, but something that is largely preventable due to something as simple as race and the risk factors associated with it. So when I speak in this room, it's really how can we make an impact? We're used to systemic pouring down or having that porous nature, but now is my postulation as what can we do interpersonally, community-wise, and institutionally to then help flow up to create equity. Overall, what I just described with disparity is that this creates limitations, not only in, say, our mere understanding of Alzheimer's, but simply if you see a loved one, how do you say this is an issue there? How do you recognize it? Where are the materials that you would like to speak with? What are the institutions that you would trust? We have no idea because of the lack of representation. That means everything currently is compromised. We do not understand how pharmacologic interventions as well as lifestyle interventions may be thought of, adopted by, and move forward and benefit African Americans. And I see that as a large limitation. Even more importantly, say if we were to move toward a cure, will the community, African Americans, trust us with that? The information we provide in a culturally sound way to communicate with them about these issues and to trust us in order to have research benefit them. So either way we cut it, we are looking at limitations without African American representation. So with the past, I see the present as the wave of the future, meaning now. There are many in this room who are doing work around African Americans and Alzheimer's, including myself, and there are many people in here committed to eradicating this disease from our communities. So for those in the room, I find it in two ways that we can move forward from disparity to equity. And that would be one, the first is the erasure of damage-centered language. I propose moving away from thinking about disease, disparity, and disadvantage, especially in the way that we may think about African Americans, their lived experiences, but also the techniques that we use. Constant comparisons with African Americans and whites, also thinking about lacking qualitative research around understanding the lived experience there, and then also what are the strengths, the resilience, the coping that's inherent within African American communities that we can there leverage to then combat this stigmatizing disease. Okay? The second point would lead into the erasure of negative narratives. So they're kind of coupled together, these 2 points, but it's not enough to say abstain. I won't do it, you won't do it, but really calling out when we are in the presence of someone having a negative narrative, meaning, so if African Americans are at disadvantage, they are at risk, this is language that may turn off our communities from wanting to work with us to solve this issue. So I propose a sea change there. One way that we're doing that at Rush is through a model that my colleagues and I call the NGAGE model. This is a 5-step model, but just like anything with research, is very porous. So the steps are sequential. So meaning you have 1, network, 2, giving first, 3, advocating for research, 4, giving back, and then 5, evaluating your efforts. But it's really all mixed in together, but I'll go through each step. But the key piece here is right in the middle, is that all of our efforts are community-based. That means we do not expect individuals to come to us. We go out, meet with them, and get to know them as people to facilitate healthy aging and the eradication of Alzheimer's. Okay? Our first step, and I argue as the hub of everything, is networking. So we know with anything from research collaborations to getting to know someone, the basic foundation is relationships. So you have to be able to say, who are the individuals in which I would like to serve? And this causes you to think about, we're not talking about African Americans, say, simply faith-based or sorority-oriented or simply teachers' unions, but really understanding the intersectionality and heterogeneity that's inherent right here among African Americans. Thinking about, well, we can go to churches, of course, other organizations, but having that tree branch approach to say, you're an expert in this area once we get to know different organizations, and then tell me, who should I be talking to? Who are the people in the know around healthy aging, Alzheimer's, and just being African American, and let them be the triage to let them introduce you to those individuals. But also, with that confidence comes the ability to step out without fear. This is not the ability to say only African American researchers or staff do it. It's a diversity in ideas, just not appearance there. So it's really making sure that you get out there and make yourself known. I have here a map of all of the neighborhoods in Chicago, which is quite diverse, but it's a place that we pride ourselves in knowing every nook and cranny of that great city. Now, through your networking, not just with, say, stakeholders, so people who are pastors or directors of organizations, but you're also able to say, what are your needs? So we may not just simply jump into Alzheimer's or cognitive aging, but say, are you interested in diet, exercise, sleep activity? People are well informed, they are curious, and they want to know, and they are looking to partner with you in order to do so. This is about community building, community capacity building. So for us, we take the time to say, well, we evaluate what are some of the topics being asked. What would people like to hear about in relation to health? And then we pull upon our resources and produce those different talks in order to meet that need, but also do fun stuff, like say to the left where you can see chair yoga class that I like to practice quite a bit. So if you're looking to hear about exercise, let's demonstrate. If you're looking to hear about diet, let's talk about it. And then ultimately we're able to produce quick materials that are culturally relevant and scientifically relevant about how you may be able to leverage your strengths that are already inherent. Now, this is years in the making, and Give First is not something that may happen in 6 months. It's an iterative process, it's cyclical, it's something that you may have to start back with networking. Say if there's a new director or a new participant stakeholder, you may have to go back to the start, and that's where resilience comes in. But however, once you make it here, you put forth the first effort, and that good first step, knowing the history of African Americans in this country and understanding their relationship to research, you could say, well, now that we've built this relationship with at least 3 to 4 different groups, would you mind hearing about some of the research that we have? Well, can we do a talk about the importance on African American participation in research, how you can benefit and what you're contributing when you do so? And then continue to build that relationship through science and through research. After each talk, we have something called an interest form. So it's not simply a blind talk, it's how to say, what did you expect before we got here and what did you get after we left? And then most critically to understand, how interested are you in research? Are you potentially committed, very committed, and can we call you? If so, we make a point to connect with folks within 24 to 48 hours to show that we are committed as well and to set forth a good faith effort with our participants and our greater communities at large. Now, this is not something that will simply be a one and done deal. To the right is a flyer of my own HERD study, Health Equity Through Aging Research and Discussion. The first part was focus groups. I'm a big person on you can't address an issue if you don't know what the issue is from someone's perspective. We can have our ideas, but what are the ideas and beliefs in relation to Alzheimer's that's already out there? Just to have the focus group, I had to have contact with at least 179 individuals just to have 45 people, and that is with existing cohorts. So this is something that we have to embed in our time throughout the research process, not something that is separate from our research. Now, a big criticism of research, especially among African American communities that are first to give but maybe last to benefit, is how do we give back? Meaning, how do we close that loop? What did you find out from these people's data? How are you able to leverage that? What are the publications that you've done? Really, it's closing the loop and sharing research findings with vast communities, not say just one group of people, but really all of those that we may be able to come in contact with. Recently, we had an event with Dr. Barnes, her Mars celebration, 15 years, where all the docs came out and they are saying, this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing, this is our finding, and then this is what we plan to do next. So priming individuals would say, this is how we would like to see it go forth, but this is what we found thanks to you and your contribution. This is the ability to facilitate the relationship between participant and researcher, but even more so, communities, academic, as well as African American. Now, I have this as the fifth slide, but it's really embedded throughout, and that's evaluation. It's not something to say, well, at the end of this event, we'll have a survey, but really to understand what did they think? How can we do it better? That's equal partnership with our African American communities, the people that we partner with to further Alzheimer's research. Two ways in which we do so is, of course, pre and post presentation surveys, but also focus groups. Can you let us know the concerns that you may have? Are we representing the data correctly? Is this what you think that you are seeing within your communities? This is what we are able to assess by doing these focus groups. But also furthering the NGAGE model is what I call NGAGE 2. It's where we have critically beforehand new projects, those say with our ADC pilot grants, getting information before studies are funded, before we have even submitted for funding. What are your ideas on the utilization, relevance, and applicability into the communities in which you live? And hearing their voice first in order for us to present the proposal together. Now, that's our NGAGE model, but as I reflected on it this past, say, year or so, I started thinking about what are the underlying principles. What are we really talking about here in meaning of this 5-step NGAGE model? And I noticed seven things that we have to have undergirding our efforts with African Americans in order to make research feel at home for them. The first one is being purpose. And this is not to say, of course, we have a research purpose in that with our studies, our program of research, but it's really in light of communities, meaning what is their knowledge of the topic that you are investigating? How have they interacted with your institutions in the past? What is the bandwidth with them with other institutions? Who are the other players in your field? Meaning, you have to understand also the common beliefs and practices that individuals are vacillating with. Alzheimer's is a critically stigmatizing, debilitating issue. How do people cope with that? You cannot have a purpose of your research study if you do not know how it is lived within the communities in which you hope to serve. So that is what I suggest with having as a first step with understanding the true purpose of your research study and understanding what is the involvement, knowledge, and experience among the people that you would like to serve already, and being able to go to different neighborhoods of African Americans, different groups, to understand that a Black woman's experience or a younger woman's experience or even LGBTQIA individuals who are Black, they may not have the same thought, knowledge, or experience with Alzheimer's or any research topic as others may have. But that leads into relevance. So what does your research question address more broadly? What is it fitting into? So my question could be, why do individuals, African Americans, say yes or no to brain donation? But what I'm really understanding is how can we then understand African American health, brain health, in a larger context, a public health issue. But then I can step back and say, what are the implications of my work? Unexpected and expected once this comes to fore. I can say, how relevant is it? What narrative will it speak to? And how will it be received by the community in which I'm hoping to serve? But on the flip side, is this even on the community's radar? With all of the prioritization that is happening, people struggling with caregiving, other priorities, happy times, good times, is Alzheimer's on their radar? Why should it be, and how can you convey that message culturally sensitive to your community members and those that you work with? Now here's a key thing that I sort of grapple with as talking to colleagues and others, is the idea of representation. And for me, representation is simply because we are here. So outside of that, there should be no other explanation. So you have to reflect as researchers to think, am I only necessity-minded or am I equity-minded? So is it a necessity that, say, from NIH or another group, that we have so many African Americans in our studies, or is it because we must solve this issue that is plaguing African American communities that we live with? So after that, you have to see that that's related to the authenticity and portrayal of yourself and your institution and you as a researcher through the communities in which you serve. Now, through a year, 2, 3, that will come out. So it's best to reflect to yourself, how can I be equity-minded and to understand these issues? But fourth is the issue of resilience. I had taken out resistance there and thought about it in a more strength-based way, meaning resilience. African Americans have endured and we are flexible. So how can we harness that in order to say, how can we bond together in order to increase African American representation in research to ultimately find better preventive methods, treatments, and cure for Alzheimer's disease? But here you have to be able to hold on and stay in communication. This is not something that may happen overnight. Simply that you have 1 or 2 years that may be able to sustain itself. Let participants know exactly what's going on in your study, the transparency. All of those things go into the key role of research into a community's endurance. Without research, there is no health, and without health, there's no us. So we have to take that into account as we think about our outreach, recruitment, and engagement methods. But that's also a recognition of who we are. So that's players as researchers, but also as a community having final say and agency. They have the ability to say yes, no, here are some tips that we can provide for you in our partnership. They are living dual realities. As we think about African Americans overall, there's a common African American Black experience, but there's also individuality. And that is what I propose that we are able to, say, embed within the NGAGE model and our outreach efforts to say, how do we toggle behind those two realities? To say, be able to address a certain community of African Americans for who they are, but keep the common recognition that we are all living in a common disparity of increased Alzheimer's risk for this population. Now, what I've prided myself on was to really think of how can we be solution-oriented. So not necessarily simply describe what's going on or to have different methodologies for that, but to say, well, what are we going to do now? What are the strategies that we can implement? What are the activities that we can have? What are the materials that you need to foster critical community mass and understanding Alzheimer's and to have healthy aging? But to do so together through research. So here I'm proposing a paradigm shift, and that would be from disparity to equity. So we know that there's an issue that is common. We know that there's severe underrepresentation. But now leveraging the NGAGE model, other models that I heard about from the Knight ADRC today, and scores of others that we may have simply going on and undocumented, unquantified, and then say, how can we put this to use? Closing our own loop from last year's workshop to say what is truly next and how we engage with communities of color as well as eradicating this disease. So there are 4 key points here. And that would be moving from disparity to equity would allow us to be poised to have effective information, prevention, and treatment, not simply saying having more cognitive activity or social activity, but how can you incorporate that into your lifestyle? How can you prioritize? How can a caregiver help their loved one or a family member or even communities? That will help us eradicate the negative narratives that we not only have of ourselves as researchers, but as the outside community of African Americans may have towards us as well, and the role of research. But in flip, seeing African Americans and the communities that I represent and scores of others to say, what are the strengths? How do you cope with this? What are ways that may work for you so we can eradicate that in an effort to move forward? We have to have explanation to then equity. It's not enough to have the information tools, but to make them accessible, to make them readable, and to make them able to be adapted for the lives that individuals live. Just being at risk for Alzheimer's does not mean life has ended. It means that we simply have to figure out a way to stave it off and to prevent it from future generations. But with this equity, we are not done. So with equity, we can level the playing field, but however, it takes encouragement to have empowerment. So even if everyone is provided with what they're needed, can they use it well? Are they empowered to use it well? And will they continue to do so? So I would like to think for everyone in the room, always consider attitudes, meaning yours as a researcher, as a member of society, and think about how you can work to change that, to view from negative-minded to perhaps saying from disparity to equity. So all of our attitudes stem from either a learned behavior, something that has benefited us, or a way that we're trying to reconcile negative things. But we know that the stronger the attitude, the stronger its impact on behavior. So we know that having those attitudes is not something that happens overnight or changes overnight. The tapestry of disparity didn't happen yesterday, and changing and empowering African Americans to participate in research and ultimately to have better solutions, treatment, prevention, and educational materials will not do so either. That will need to have persistence, time, and consistency. Okay? That means assessing and evaluating our efforts regularly and our mixed methods approaches that I am so fond of, meaning having the participant perspective, but also being able to quantify our work for future programs. Now, one thing I would like everyone to keep in mind as we speak about this from time to time is that this is not something, speaking about Alzheimer's, underrepresentation, African American, disparity, racism, this is not something that may be comfortable or even inspiring, but it is something worthy of note, serious, and if we do not address it, we are looking at even compounded issues in the future. So it is clear to say that we're talking about our roles in this room, but also larger structures that we can tackle through research. Okay? So one last thought is simply to say that today's audience, with their collective interests and challenges, continue to inspire me as we work toward being able to have healthy aging and cognitive health for everyone and for us, African Americans. And I would like to say thank you. Any questions or thoughts even?
You were phenomenal.
That's kind of you to say. Thank you. All right.
Thank you for your lecture, first and foremost. How do the arts play into helping individuals with disease? How does that go?
So a really great program that we have is called Arts for Brain Health. And if you want more information, I can get that. So it's really through painting, music, and what we call exercise therapy, which is really yoga, that we are able to help individuals, not only those afflicted with the disease, but their family members, to say, have an old record playing, or to even do things that, say, a little bit of movement that can then at least stave off further devolve with the disease, but we have that, the Arts for Brain Health, and we also really express the role of diet, exercise, music, and purpose. And that's expressed largely through our collaboration with the Art Institute in Chicago, and that may be similar here, through painting. Yeah. So that is a definite role, and I did see a lot of that being mentioned lately in the past conferences that I'm at, art and yoga, and understanding how to cope, be resilient, as well as move forward with the disease. Oh. So the question was, at what age should we start having the eye out for Alzheimer's symptoms? So what I advised my father to do, and what my family member, is that we looked at our family history first to see, especially with genetics playing such a strong role. But then also, I started looking with my father, say, as early as 55. I must admit, just simply being at high alert. But in our research studies, typical age is 65 years and older that are participants. But for me, being on heightened alert and a paranoid daughter, I started thinking at 55. Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
I'm curious if your work have come across any solutions or alternatives to the negative language you were talking about, especially like 2 times that rest.
Yes. Yes.
If you've actually come up with any better language.
Yes. So the question was, how have I either struggled or worked with changing my own narratives around African Americans and Alzheimer's? So the first step is mindfulness, to even be able to say, well, this may be an issue, because I find issue with it that we speak about our communities, African Americans, in such a negative way. So how I do is to bounce ideas off of colleagues that are here. How would you feel if I was speaking about, say, a relative, a loved one, or your family member? If you would feel offended or a little bit off-put by that, then I would definitely go back to the drawing board. But the other way that I've done so is by reading. So looking at other fields, I go back to my social psych roots, social work, as well as nursing, to look at strength-based models with how we can move from disparity to equity language. Mm-hmm. So the question was the best use and how do you formulate focus groups? So that being, I was trained in that, so it's really having participants a forum that they can share their own perspectives. But really, I would suggest that would be a, say, offline conversation between you and I outside of this forum, that we can talk about ways and papers that I've written around that. Yes, yeah.
It's so easy for researchers to get bogged down in the day-to-day that you can
Yes.
lose yourself.
Definitely.
Just in the data, the information, and that. So when it's all said and done, what's your end game? What do you want to happen after you come up with the great concepts, the 4-part window of time, and all of those things? And you, at the end of the day, what do you want to see happen?
There are 3 things that I would like to see happen. I would love to see equity in terms for African Americans, meaning that no one group's risk is higher than the other, but also not only just say with the disease, but having risk factors, being able to enjoy a comfortable way of life, having purpose, being able to capitalize on all that the community has to offer, as well as more resources for individuals. So 1 is to achieve equity. 2 is to make sure it's just not in my own backyard, meaning it's just not in Chicago or the people that I know, so to take it worldwide. And then lastly, it would be for everyone to feel empowered. So even if you are faced with this disease, you know where to get information, you know how to target it, and you know how to move forward for your own family's sake. Because I see that as being the biggest issue that we're facing now, is loss of life quality of life for our African American families. So that would be my end game, is healthy aging and good quality of life.
So can I just do a partly?
Yes.
And that strictly is what do you need for that to become a reality?
I think that may have been a little lost in the sauce with the talk with two things. One, for even more of my colleagues to come on board with that thinking, but also being met even more so, because I've personally been met more than halfway by the communities in which I serve, but continued trust in order to do that. So it's two parts: the understanding, the critical movement on all of our colleagues' sides, and then also the continued trust and participation from African Americans. Okay.
What your sense is of how successful you've been in, like, if you're trying to increase the participation of Alzheimer's disease research. So what's your sense of how well you've done, and how much you increase, for instance, participation rates, and your sense of how you do it?
So his question was, how are we doing with increasing? I would say through this model here is going quite well. And it's a way to say, start off, however, but we're constantly tweaking, meaning it's not okay to simply have a way to engage with an individual. So I see it as separate: outreach, engagement, and then a request for recruitment. And that's just not a one-time thing. So I think with this model here, continuously being there, not simply a researcher or a world apart, but being embedded within the community so they know that research is a resource. That's what I truly think is able to increase the numbers that we're enjoying or seeing at Rush. Now, we do have quantification methods, so ways that we measure that and we can see it, but I really think that it is us being a consistent face for research in the community. Yes.
What do you think the biggest challenge is with objectives?
The biggest challenge in meeting objectives, personally, sometimes fatigue, I would say. So say working with that, but also with, I always feel as if time is running out. So I talk so much about the importance of time, and it takes persistence, consistency, as well as time. But for me, in my mind, this has already happened. It happened yesterday. No time can be fast enough. So it's dealing with the urgency, but also being mindful that I'm not just talking as a researcher. I'm a Black woman, I'm a wife, I'm a daughter. I'm concerned about my father, my husband, and to really think, how would I like someone to approach me? So it's not necessarily a methodology, but a way of mind that may be a challenge for me. Fatigue, as well as wanting to blaze through things. Yeah.
How young is your youngest participant, and how old is your oldest participant?
Now, I must admit that I do not know. I don't know the oldest or youngest, but I do know we have individuals in their late 50s, early 60s, all the way into the 100s. So there are some very good, that's why I talk so much about healthy aging. There are plenty of examples of that, and I want us to capitalize on that. All right, so I'll say just thank you one more time.